Greetings. This lecture is going to be on international human resource management, specifically how do we handle a global workforce. You've addressed some of these issues in your Management 330 class, if you've taken that here, where we talked about the different ways that organizations can globalize. We're going to take it a step further. It's not just about figuring out how to do business in other countries, but how do we manage the people side of things in different countries. So we will be covering that in this particular lecture. Moving on to the second slide. As you know, we have three different stages of international involvement. There's the expatriate, where we have an individual from our company goes and lives and works in another country. Then we have a multinational corporation where the firm has a clear home location, but they set up facilities in different countries. And so we might have a company here in the United States, let's say Boeing, but they might have manufacturing and parts facilities all over the world. Transnational corporation is where they don't really have any major ties to their country of origin. In fact, they're much more interested in finding the best place at the best value with the best employees to be able to do their work. So they see the whole planet really as their opportunity for setting up a business. They don't limit themselves to only particular areas. They think of themselves as across boundaries. They don't even think about the boundaries. The goal of a transnational corporation is to be much more decentralized than a multinational. The transnational really focuses and works at the local level, as opposed to a multinational, which has a tighter tie back to that country of origin. So in our next slide, we can see the different stages here of international involvement. At the very middle, you see domestic operations, where the firm is working exclusively in the United States. That might be a local mom and pop store. And then you have export operations, then you have subsidiaries and joint ventures, multinational operations, and then transnational operations. And we've already talked about the multinational and the transnational. Exports, as you know, is where the company takes the opportunity to export products that they make here in the country, but they sell them abroad. And then subsidiaries and joint ventures is where they physically move some parts of their operation to another location. For example, a company might move their customer service center to India or to Ireland because they want English-speaking group, but at the same time they want to ensure that that they're taking advantage of the lower costs in international locations. So in terms of the next slide, here we go into a little bit more detail on the outsourcing, and basically what that means with outsourcing is that we are outsourced companies, usually beyond the companies that export. When they actually set up locations, they will outsource their work, so that what they do is they will set up locations in another part of the world. They set up a parts manufacturing plant or an assembly plant, or maybe some sort of distribution channels, and the whole point of that is they're taking advantage of cheaper costs, perhaps less regulations. That's not always a cool thing to do, but that's clearly some of the motivations that companies have. They'll do it because it's cheaper for them and they have less constraints. So some of the challenges, of course, that go with that is the issues of safety and security, and particularly when you are in a place where it may be a little bit more volatile. If it's a developing country, there is less guarantees around issues of security. You may have problems with safety in terms of the products not being constructed appropriately and safely. Other countries might use products and processes that are not acceptable here in the US, but in those other countries, those are acceptable tactics, and that's not always appropriate when products come back here to the United States. The last challenge, of course, is when you have a customer service rep that you're dealing with from another country and they can't speak English and they can't work with you. That can be a major problem. So if they have strong English skills, that's not an issue, but if they don't have the strong English speaking skills, that outsourcing can backfire for you tremendously. We see a lot more falling barriers to be able to do work abroad, although we just, we know that the UK just decided to leave the European Union, so that's going to create some issues and more barriers now for free trade, in the European Union, and it remains to be seen what impact the UK leaving the European Union will have on our relationship with the UK. But generally speaking, when we have trade agreements and things like that, these barriers tend to fall away as we think about building free trade zones that enables people to buy and sell. And the downsides, of course, of these free trade zones is that it does find that a lot of work gets exported or outsourced. The positive side is we can have sometimes more effective production, lower costs, and we can bring lower costs to the customer. I think that's one important thing to factor in is that employers and companies always assume that people only want to deal with things that are low cost. And they might to a point, but not always. Sometimes people are much more driven by quality of service or quality of the attributes of the product and less concerned about the price. So I think companies have to really determine whether or not it's beneficial for them to outsource parts of their business if they find that the outsourcing is going to cause more problems than not. Moving on to slide 5, the mix of host country and expatriate employees. Basically, when we have a wholly owned subsidiary or joint ventures of some sort, the question has to be who's going to manage that overseas unit? Who is going to deal with that unit that's located in Timbuktu or in India or in China? Is it going to be a local person that's going to manage it, or is it going to be this from the home country? So 3 basic approaches. The ethnocentric approach, is where it has to be the way we do it here in the home country. If it's the United States, then we argue that we're going to do what the home country does. The polycentric approach is focused on how we use the staff and personnel from the host country, the country where we're actually doing the work, and we use them to staff our business. And so the whole idea is, even though it's a U.S. company, if we're doing work in India, it's managed by the people in India. The geocentric approach is a little bit more complex than that. The geocentric approach is where we really just don't pay attention to home country or host country. We bring in the manager and the staff that are the best people for the job, no matter how we slice that. And that's a little bit more complex because the challenge we run into with a geocentric approach is that the new manager may not know that location. They may not even be familiar with the host location or the home location. They might come from a third country. So it means it's a U.S. company, we're doing business in India, and the manager's from France. While it has a lot of benefits in that it really broadens the way that we think about doing business, the challenge, of course, is, if you need people who can specialize in that location on occasion, and depending on what it is, what industry you're in. So there's pluses and minuses to all these approaches, the ethnocentric, polycentric, and geocentric approach, and you have to figure out which one is going to work best for you in your company. Okay, your next slide, slide 6, we're talking about the reliance on expatriates. When are we more likely to use expatriates? Because that's really the major concern for us in human resource management, is how do we manage our expatriates? We typically use expatriates when there's not a lot of local talent. So basically we go in, we assess whether or not we want to start a business. We need to look at the skills and abilities of the people in the local area. If we need talent and skills that the local area doesn't have, we need to export our talent to that location so that they can then do the job. So it's really important that we know going into it, assessing the human capital in that area to know whether or not we will get the skilled workers that we need to do that work. Another reason why we might rely on expatriates is if we have a business strategy that really is much more global. And if we have a global vision, we want something to be more ethnocentric, polycentric, or even geocentric, we are going to be using expatriates even at one level or another. We may let the subsidiary manage the location in a polycentric focus. That doesn't mean that we aren't going to have expatriate managers from the home location go there and work with the local workers. So that gives them some expertise in the local area, but also it brings home country expertise to the local area as well. So there's polycentric doesn't always mean that it's only the local people, but it means that primarily it's being run by the local people. Another reason why we might use expatriates is when our international units and domestic operations are very interdependent. And if they're interdependent, then there's a lot of go between the international unit and the home unit. Tight, information in terms of resources or controls or marketing plans or strategies, you name it. So when these things are tightly woven together and they need to depend on each other, then we use expatriates to help make that transition work well. We also can use expatriates when the political situation in the host country is really unstable. For example, if you were to go in and do business in Venezuela right now, it's a bit unstable. So what we would end up doing is ensuring that we've got our own people there who have the home country's best interests at heart. So someone from the United States would go to Venezuela and they would be making sure that they were addressing the needs of issues and they can assess the political situation and advise the company when it's appropriate to pull out. If you're using local folks, they would be less attuned to that and less loyal to the home country and much more loyal to the host country. So the goal, of course, is that we would want to be in a situation where our home country's issues are being addressed. So we would, if there's political unrest, we would be more likely to use expatriates. Lastly, when there are really significant cultural differences between the host and the home, the goal is having that expatriate go in there as a bridge between the two cultures. They would work in the foreign location, but they would be bringing in home country values and norms and things like that to help bridge the gap between the two very distinct and different cultures. And number 7, what are some of the challenges that come with expatriate assignments? One of the biggest issues, of course, is that it creates problems. Culture shock's a big issue, right? I mean, people go to a new place and they think it's all going to be fun and games, and then they realize that, they can't watch Monday Night Football, and the kind of food that they like to eat is no longer available. Their favorite toothpaste is no longer there. Nobody understands them. They don't understand the culture. They don't know the language. These are all sorts of problems that can pop up. 20 to 40% of expatriate assignments from the U.S. fail miserably, whereas it is significantly less in Europe and Asia. So if a European individual or an Asian individual is in an expatriate assignment here in the United States, they're far more likely to be successful than we are as expatriates in their countries, in Europe or Asia or wherever. Why is that? Well, because we really don't do a good job of preparing our employees for expatriate assignments. Families are not prepared for the separation. No one does enough cultural training. And the home country doesn't always value international experience and international exposure. We spend too much time focused on people's technical qualifications and less on whether or not they're going to be adaptable and be able to work within a particular culture. We are pretty ethnocentric here in the United States. We believe our way is the right way. We believe that our way of seeing things, our way of doing business is the only way to go. And so our challenge is, how do we get our people prepared for a world that does business very different than us? And many people do business very different from us. The norms, the expectations. If you recall the country assignments that you did in Management 330, that's a big part of why we had you do those assignments, is so that you could understand why these countries are different, how business is done differently, and there's not one right way to be when it comes to the business environment. So next slide. Aside from the problems with adjustments there and the career barriers and things like that, sometimes returns are also challenging for expatriates. They come back to the home country and no one cares that they learned a new language and they learned how to do business in Taiwan. They have been out of the local market for a while, so even though they have more advanced experience in other areas, locally they're seen as, well, you weren't here for the last 3 years, we don't know what your skill set is like, and they minimize that. It also means that we haven't done a really good job of helping them get prepared for the return to the United States. Just as we try to prepare people to go to international assignments,
we also have to do a good job of preparing them to return. So it is really important that we take time to not only prepare them to take the assignment on, but we also need to prepare them for that return and prepare the organization for how to manage those people who return. So there's a lot of work on HR's part to manage both of these aspects.
Selecting people for expatriate positions is always challenging because most of the time employers in the United States focus on technical skills, and these are the people that we tend to send to these expatriate assignments. The larger challenge is, how do those people with great technical skills cope in an environment where it'll be very different? For example, if you're used to Monday Night Football, now you don't have an opportunity to watch Monday Night Football because they don't have Monday Night Football on the local television in Thailand. They may have soccer, or they may have lacrosse, or they may have other types of sporting events that you're not familiar with. If a person is going for an extended period of time, their family has to come along too. The family needs to be better prepared. And so when you're screening candidates and selecting candidates for international assignments, it's not just about making sure they have technical skills, but they really need to understand what it's going to be like to live in that environment. As you guys learned in Management 330, you want to make sure you've got expatriates who are involved in the selection process, because they know what the experience is going to be like, they know the right questions to ask, they know what the challenges are going to be. And it's also really important to ensure that the spouses are involved, as well as the children who may be going along, that they're prepared for whatever culture shock or changes may arise. From the perspective of training begins almost immediately, but absolutely it takes probably about a year of preparation before someone can go. Part of it is learning what that location is like to live in. So there's all the living and cultural issues, as we've already talked about, and as I said, you've already learned in Management 330. And so HR has to be prepared to train people in those areas. As well, you need to be training people on the way business is done in that location. So they have to be immersed in what's going on in that particular business. So they are prepared in advance. And so, again, it's also not just the manager who's leaving the home location or the host location and going to the home location and going to the host location, but it's also about training the people there to be ready for somebody who's coming in. So how are they going to work with them? How are they going to be culturally prepared to work with someone from a different country for them, from their perspective, right? So someone in Thailand has a norm about the way they like to do business, but now they have someone from the United States who's coming. And that person coming from the United States doesn't understand culture, and the Thai people are probably going to take that for granted, that they should know about it. So, they have to understand how the American is going to work in Thailand, and the Thai people have to understand, and the American has to understand how the Thai people do their work. So it goes both ways. And as well, because a family may be going, or even if they're not going, they need to be prepared for what it's going to be like to live separated from their spouse for an extended period of time if they're not going, and what that's going to be like for them living in a foreign country, and what the challenges are going to be as they come back. And then lastly, if they're going to be there, what's it going to be like for them as people who are living in a foreign country but don't have any citizenship rights, or really are on an extended work or school vacation for a period of time, and what it's going to be like to live there. Now, the interesting thing is, people who have been in the military, or whose parents were in the military, and you've traveled about the world with your parents, you understand this, right? You take this for granted, and I think to some extent the military tries to do a really good job of supporting families, as they are shipped to different out of country bases, and to be stationed in different locations. I don't think that in the United States we do as good a job of that. When it comes to training our domestic workers, non-military workers. And so the military, I think, does a way better job of this, and I think they're a really good role model for helping corporations get their employees prepared. From a career development perspective, this can be pretty challenging for the expatriate because, as I've already said, some of the challenges that our expatriates have in returning to the United States is it may be that domestic locations or home locations may not appreciate or value the experience that an individual had in a foreign country. So we need to prepare those who are here, who are receiving the expatriate back into the United States, to help them understand issues of career development. What skills did they learn? How are they transferable or translatable to skills needed to work in the domestic environment? Now, if your company is much more globally focused or more multinational focused, then they may do a really good job of this. But if you are in the beginning stages of internationalization, then the challenge you're really going to run into is how do you get your organization up to speed and ready to understand the nuances of managing an employee through all the stages of their career when you're sending them off on international assignments. So how do you make sure that the international employee is received well? How do you ensure that your expatriate knows how to advocate for themselves in terms of their own career development? How do we help them translate the skills that they learned in that international environment to something that can be useful here in the United States? And so that's a key issue. Now, if we have a spouse that's going with the expatriate to that foreign location, perhaps we can find a way to help them with their career development. If someone has to take a break in their career in order to follow their spouse to a new location, what does that then mean for that person as they return to the United States? They now have a gap in their resume, and that may be a concern to employers, how serious they are as an employee, because they may have taken a year or 2 or even 3 years off to go live in a foreign location. So whatever we can do to help support that spouse, that's part of our responsibility in career development as well. Compensation is another concern for managing expatriate employees, more so from the perspective of how do we handle tax implications, how do we handle issues like cost of living, as that may vary based on location to location, how do we deal with the cost differentials, how do we deal with when that person returns, the change in their income level, how do we just generally manage the pay questions and from an internal equity situation? A person may learn to live in a particular way when they're in a foreign location that may require them to have, for example, in some countries it's not uncommon to have help in the form of a housekeeper or a cook or something like that. For example, if you live in Hong Kong or in Indonesia, that's not uncommon to have somebody come in and do your housework and do your cleaning and do all those sorts of things for you. So, when you return to the United States, your income will be decreased because you are not needing to manage that anymore. You're not going to have that right or that privilege anymore. The other issues to consider also are exchange rates. And how do you manage the exchange rate between one country and another? In one country, it may vary based on changes in the economy, and it may have one exchange rate at one point in time, but as the exchange rate fluctuates because of world issues, we need to be thinking of that in terms of pay levels. I think the bottom line when it comes to compensation is that you have to recognize it is not cheap to send somebody to an expatriate position. I mean, there has to be great value in sending that person there for a whole host of reasons. It's a value for the host country, a value for the home country, to make sure that that's done well, because you have not just your compensation issues in terms of paying them equitably and fairly to live in that country, But you've got all the training issues that you've got to consider and the selection issues you've got to consider. So there are some high costs involved here. The next couple slides are going to deal with the role of the HR department in all this. And while we've talked about that to some extent, you know, how they are involved in the hiring process and the screening process and the training process and the compensation issues. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. And also some extra considerations regarding sending a woman to an international assignment. One of the biggest challenges that I had when I used to work for a software company that had clients all over the place, and this is in the 80s, right? We had people working in the software company who were having to work in Japan. Now, first of all, we didn't have synchronous conversations like we could today regarding, or asynchronous decision, communication, like, and using the internet and emails, because we just didn't have emails in the late 80s. It just wasn't common to use in business. So, but we could talk on the phone, but we had to talk on the phone when either their business opened or our business closed in order to have communication. And the biggest challenge that we had, aside from just the logistics of managing clients who are in foreign countries, was we had to deal with problems and concerns around sending a woman to Japan. Today, it's less of a problem, but in the late 80s, when we would try to send a female who was our lead documenter, and she would write the documentation for software, for the manuals and things like that, she was not respected. They wouldn't listen to her. So we needed to make sure that we handled some of those issues appropriately. So if you're going to be sending a woman to an international assignment, that's a concern. So in terms of developing HR policies, as you've generally already learned in Management 330, we really need to consider Hofstede's dimensions of culture, and also recognize that a one-size-fits-all approach to managing organizations and HR policies is probably not going to work, because the policies and issues that we think are appropriate from an ethical or legal perspective here in the United States may not be relevant in a global context. And so we need to develop our HR policies with the local location in mind, and what the culture is and the norms are in those locations. And I'm not going to review the Hofstede's dimensions. You guys already should be familiar with that. But again, recognizing how power distance and individualism and uncertainty and time orientation are really going to change the way that we think about our policies. We spent a lot of time in this class talking about the EEO laws, right, and how they influence what an HR professional needs to do in terms of managing their employees. What you have to recognize is that a foreign national employee working outside of the United States is not covered under U.S. law. They are required to follow the laws of the local location. Now, we can have our own sort of policies about how we handle our employee, but in terms of the laws, the employment laws, we need to follow the employment laws of the host country. So that means if the country says, we can say, I'm not going to hire you because you're a woman, or I'm not going to hire you because you're a parent and you have children, we have to follow that. We have to follow that rule and guideline, particularly if it's not illegal to do that. And so if our employee, may make a decision based on that, or the other people in the company are making a decision based on that, that employee doesn't have any control over those issues. You have to follow the employment law of the local location. Now, in terms of immigration and control, any non-U.S. citizen working here in the United States, coming from a different home country and the United States is the host country, we have to follow U.S. law to protect them, regardless of where they live, regardless of their citizenship. They may not be discriminated against, as you know, because we don't discriminate based on ethnicity, race, etc. So you don't have to be a citizen to fall under the guidelines of our employment laws. There are a number of important caveats to consider when you're developing HR policies in foreign countries. And the most important thing is to recognize that national culture is not a static thing. Culture changes over time. People change over time. I mean, Japan is a great example. I mean, I told you in the late 80s how, sending a woman to Japan to do work and to work with employees was a ridiculous idea because they wouldn't work with that woman. They wouldn't respect that woman in the workplace. And today they are more open to that. They are much more respectful. They will work with female executives, in terms of those situations. And so I think it's very important you recognize that culture changes and you need to be on top of those culture changes over time. We don't really know, no one's really done some good research on whether or not a company is successful or will fail given the kinds of HR practices that they do relative to culture. But we do have to recognize that culture does play an important role in the day-to-day operation of any business. And if we ignore company culture, and if we ignore national culture, this is going to be a concern. So I think that people do need to do some research on these particular topics, but it's mostly important for us to recognize it as a means of respect, as a means of understanding and integrating into a company. We absolutely need to make sure that we are recognizing and accepting the unique culture of that country and that company. As you know, it is incredibly difficult to change company culture, let alone a national culture. And so we have to, we can't expect changes to happen overnight, nor can we ignore culture when we're trying to set up a business and make things work. If you're a company that is not sending expatriates out, but you are simply exporting, part of the role of HR is to ensure that the employees who will be in charge of the products and the marketing and all sorts of interactions with international sales are prepared and understand that national culture. And so HR's job in this context is making sure that those employees involved in that exporting process, just as you would with an expatriate, they are familiar with and understand the laws, the cultures, the norms of that foreign location so that we can be sure to have them prepared so they know how to negotiate, how to communicate. These are important things in order for business success. And so the HR side of things, it's not just about the numbers, right? It's about how do we land that deal, and that is a soft skill, as they would call it. It is understanding the nuances of communication and understanding that international culture. In this last slide, two other major issues to consider, just as a reminder. In terms of ethics and social responsibility, is recognizing the different kinds of ethical dilemmas that an employee will face when working with and working in a different country. Also, recognizing the rules and guidelines around the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, making sure that we are not engaged in unethical and illegal behaviors by paying for access, bribing people. We cannot. So understanding the rules and guidelines around Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is really important. And lastly, of course, as we know in this current climate, we have issues of political risk. And we have countries that are facing different challenges across the board. And we need to recognize what's going on in those governments and how to work with those governments. And sometimes our expatriates get caught in the political morass between one country and another, and trying to do business in those countries, given the political climates between the two countries, may be challenging. So preparing people for the political issues and the political nuances is also really important when you're sending someone abroad. So that covers all the lecture material on international HR. Thanks.